On February 25th, 1990, a young woman named Terri Schiavo got up in the middle of the night in her apartment near Tampa, Florida. For unknown reasons, she stumbled and hit her head and went into a coma that created a case that would last for the next 15 years. By coincidence, the U.S. Supreme Court was wrapping up its famous Cruzan decision, which it would announce in June, about a similar woman named Nancy Cruzan in a coma. As we'll see, the Cruzan decision did not end the ethics of patients in comas, and the Terri Schiavo case would last for another 15 years, and also be the case that blew up bioethics and polarized bioethics. I'm Gregory Pence, and this is my personal YouTube channel where I tell stories that were really important in bioethics, and I don't want to get lost. Today's story is a really important one. So we don't know exactly why Terri went into a coma. She had been anorectic. She had been on some kind of tea diet. She probably had low potassium. There's a kind of hypopotassium problem that can lead to idiopathic encephalopathy and brain damage. According to a malpractice suit later, this could have been the cause of Terri's coma. In any case, Terri was taken to a hospital, and it soon became apparent that she was in something like a persistent vegetative state. So in this state, Terri needed to eat. So physicians, with the consent of her husband, Michael, inserted a percutaneous gastronomic endoscopy tube, also called a PEG tube, which is basically a tube from the outside into the stomach where a slushy, nutritious fluid would keep Terri's body alive. Michael Schiavo then attempted to find out what was wrong with Terri and get her help. So there was also Terri's parents who were involved in this case. At first, their parents and Michael got along. Michael, after 2 months, transferred Terri to a rehabilitation center and became her legal guardian with no objection from Terri's parents. They were trying to get Terri better. Some extraordinary things were done. Michael actually had Terri's body and her flown to California for an experimental deep brain thalamic stimulator to see if this would help get her out of the coma. Terri's parents briefly tried to take care of her at home, but it was too much for them, so that didn't work. So a lot of effort was put into trying to rehabilitate Terri. She must have had good insurance because at one point she was in rehabilitation center for about 18 months, where 3 different shifts of workers, 24 hours a day, tried to bring her out of her coma, bring her back to normal. She is only 27 years old at this point. During the 5 years after Terri's coma, Michael Schiavo and Terri's parents actually lived together. And after 5 years of rehabilitation, nothing really had improved in Terri. The parents at this point stopped living together. Something may have happened between them. We don't really know. One possibility is that money was involved. In the summer where they stopped living together, there was a malpractice settlement. Terri's parents were Robert and Mary Schindler, and a significant amount of money was awarded to Robert for a malpractice suit where physicians had failed to diagnose anorexia in Terri, and it was alleged that this had caused her subsequent coma. So the suit was actually against Terri's obstetrician for failure to diagnose a potassium imbalance. It was a significant amount of money, $750,000 for Terri's care, another $300,000 to Michael for loss of her companionship. And the Schindlers did not get anything of this, and this may have been the beginning of the split between them. Partially because the Schindlers got no money from this compensation, things had gone south. And at this point, physicians told Michael that there was basically no hope that Terri would ever come out of her coma, And would he sign a DNR order? In other words, if Terri had a heart attack, no efforts would be made to resuscitate, and her body would die. Michale wanted to sign such an order, but her parents, Mary and Robert Schindler, violently disagreed. They did not accept that Terri's life was over. So at this point, the Schindlers tried to become Terri's guardian, arguing that Michale had not acted appropriately in wanting a DNR order, but a local judge disagreed and said that Michale had done everything possible and that he could continue as guardian. In fact, over the next 3 years, Michale became a licensed respiratory therapist, essentially cared for her himself for the next 3 years.
Her husband vowed to make her well again and took her to numerous doctors and rehabilitation centers. But years later, after winning a $1 million malpractice judgment, Schiavo said he realized his wife would never recover.
In May of 1988, 8 years after Terri went into a coma, Michale asked the court to make a key decision. Could he authorize the PEG tube to be removed so that Terri could have a dignified death and her body could die? And he testified that she had once told him that, watching TV, that she would not want to live as a vegetable. Now, in the types of evidence in court, this is not really clear and convincing evidence, which would really take need a signed advance directive or some kind of videotape statement. It's more like a scintilla of evidence, hearsay many years later, but it's better than nothing. The Schindlers disagreed that Terri had said this and would want this. They believed that Terri was a fighter, would want to come back. And so the battle started to begin. So at this point, a local judge, Judge Greer, agreed that Terri's feeding tube could be removed. And the Schindlers began to disagree and go to the media. They appealed. It went to various appellate courts. It went to the Florida Supreme Court, all of which agreed with Michale and the Judge Greer that the feeding tube could be removed. Along the way, the Schindlers started to imply that Michale had abused Terri, that he had somehow caused her coma, and things got really nasty. At one point, the issue arose whether, if Michale didn't want to be her legal guardian, could the Schindlers just take over? And the judge asked them whether there was any circumstances when they would allow a feeding tube to be removed. Basically, the Schindlers said no, that even if Terri had gangrene and all her legs and arms had to be removed, there was no circumstances in which they would let her vegetative body die. By the fall of 2003, 13 years later, this case had become a case that we saw every night on the news. There were ministers and priests claiming that to let Terri die was not pro-life, that this was the beginning of some kind of Holocaust. Other people claimed that because Terri was severely cognitively disabled, that she qualified under the Americans with Disabilities Act and could not be let die, and nothing other than a full court press should be done in Terri's case. At this point in 2003, the case gets really politicized when Governor Jeb Bush enters on the side of Terri's parents and says that they're doing the right thing and that we cannot let Terri die because we are a culture of life and not death. At this point, various physicians are testifying in court. Neurologist Ronald Cranford, who himself was a fairly famous bioethicist, testified that Terri was in persistent vegetative state, and after 13 years, there was no chance that she would ever come back to normal. Of course, if she went in by trauma to her head, there was some small chance that she might come out. If it was really from a kind of body blow of hypoalkemia, then there's probably no chance. But after 13 years, very few people, 1 in a million have come out of persistent vegetative state. Other people wanted to try more exotic kinds of therapy. But in 2003, Jeb Bush got the legislature to pass something called Terri's Law that basically said that patients like Terri and PBS, feeding tubes could not be removed. So at this point, Michale and his lawyers appealed the case of Terri's Law to the Florida Supreme Court, which ruled that the law passed by the legislature was unconstitutional, but it interfered with the right of doctors and patients to make these decisions. The Schindlers appealed this to a federal court, which declined to overrule the Florida Supreme Court, and that's where it stayed for a while.
Look over here, Terry. Terry, there you go. Can you follow that, Terry? Yeah. There you go. Can you follow that at all? Terry? Come on. Terry, no. Come on. I'm using both sound and something. Can you follow that? Huh? Can you see that?
One of the extraordinary things in this case was the use of a very selected media video clip that appears to show that Terry's eyes are following a balloon or responding to her mother's voice. Now, we don't know how many hundreds of hours of video went into this, but it is likely that this is a very few seconds that seem to indicate that someone is home, but could be more like a neurological version of phototropism, or plants kind of bend toward the light. At this point, the case is becoming a cause célèbre every night on national news. At this point, Congress gets involved. And unfortunately, two physicians who are members of Congress do not act very professionally. Senator Bill Frist, a physician who had never actually examined Terri and who was not a neurologist, testified that Terri seemed alive to him. Another physician, Congressman Dave Weldon from Florida, also testified that he was in favor of keeping Terri alive. At this point, Terri is living essentially in Pinellas Park in a rehabilitation home. People are demonstrating on both sides every day outside of Terri's rehabilitation complex. TV cameras are there every day. Priests are there in monastic robes. The brother of Terri is there. Both sides are chanting and playing to the media. The American Civil Liberties Union is involved. It has become literally a media circuit. All kinds of people get involved besides Governor Jeb Bush. At some point, the lawyer for Michael is worried about somebody trying to bomb his car. A local judge, both the lawyer for Michael and the local judge have to inspect the underside of their car every day because they're worried about a bomb. Despite Congress getting involved and passing a law to try to keep Terri alive, the U.S. Supreme Court basically said Congress did not have the authority to do this. It declined to review appeals from the Florida Supreme Court, and eventually, after 15 years, in March of 2015, Terri's feeding tube was removed, and after 13 days, her body expired. An autopsy was then performed, and what it showed is that, surprisingly, Terri did not seem to have the characteristic tooth structure of someone who had severe anorexia, but it also showed that her brain was totally white matter, there was no gray matter, that essentially there was no one home all those 15 years, that we just had a little kind of nub of brain activity, but no one there to receive it. So after 15 years, this case concluded, but by then, people who were very conservative in religion had adopted coma patients as their cause, kind of analogous to supporting fetuses that might be aborted. People who believe in the rule of law and liberals and were kind of abhorred by having this case drag on this long were on the other side. It is very likely that if we use substituted judgment, Terri Schiavo herself would not have wanted this. She was a woman who cared a lot about her appearance, and I do not believe that she would want the world to remember her in the way her body is remembered in this state. One of the nagging questions that remain in this case is not just the polarization of bioethics, but there's a couple of strange questions. One, Michael Schiavo did not really meet the clear and convincing evidence standard for removing a feeding tube from Terri. The Cruzan decision had said that states can pass a law allowing clear and convincing evidence for removing a feeding tube or respirator for an incompetent patient. But just hearsay by Michael does not really meet the clear and convincing evidence standard. The other question is, why didn't Michael just let the Schindlers take Terri home? Was it because of the money that was involved? Because he certainly used up all the money taking care of her. Probably it's because he didn't think this is what Terri would really have wanted, to spend the rest of her life because people in PBS their bodies can live a long, long time. It's also strange that a malpractice case was awarded when probably this was not a just verdict. And also, finally, the use of the media and the use of politics to try to gain a victory that you couldn't gain either with doctors or in the courts became something that we'll see again, where people in England go to the media and try to get a result for an impaired baby. And video, carefully edited, is not necessarily the best way to solve these cases. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this story. We'll see you again next Tuesday at 4 p.m.